She was found wrapped in gold, a crown of golden leaves, a cloak of lapis and carnelian beads so dense it took months to lift. For nearly a century, the world called her a queen who died in peace, surrounded by servants who loved her enough to follow her into death. But then, someone put the skulls of those servants into a CT scanner, and what the machine saw did not match the story we had been told for 100 years, because these women did not drink poison and drift quietly to sleep. Somebody killed them, and then somebody preserved the bodies. To understand why this discovery unsettles archaeologists to this day, you have to go back to a hole in the ground in southern Iraq, in the ruins of a city older than almost anything you have a name for. The city was called Ur. 4,500 years ago, it was not a ruin at all. It was one of the beating hearts of human civilization, a place of temples, canals, accountants, and kings, at a time when most of the planet had not yet learned to write. And beneath the city, buried in the dust, lay a secret that would take a British archaeologist, a team of anthropologists, and eventually the tools of modern forensic science to fully uncover. What most people are never told is that the story changed. The version in the old books is not the version the evidence now supports, and the corrected version is much darker. Let's start with the man who first opened the ground. His name was Leonard Woolley, and between 1922 and 1934, he led one of the most ambitious excavations of the 20th century. His timing was almost cinematic, because at the very same moment, on the other side of the ancient world, another team was pulling Tutankhamun out of the sands of Egypt. The world was obsessed with golden tombs. But while Egypt got the headlines, Woolley was quietly digging into something stranger. He uncovered a vast burial ground that would come to be called the Royal Cemetery of Ur, and inside it, layer upon layer, he counted roughly 2,000 graves. Most were ordinary, but 16 of them were not. 16 of them were something the ancient world had gone to extraordinary, terrifying lengths to build. And here is where the ground begins to shift beneath you. Because in these 16 elite tombs, the dead did not lie alone. Woolley kept digging, and the deeper he went, the more bodies he found. Not one body, not two. Rows of them, human beings laid out in careful arrangement around the central figure, dressed in their finest, ornamented with jewelry, positioned as if frozen in the middle of a ceremony. Soldiers by the entrance, grooms beside the remains of oxen and wagons, and women. Rows and rows of women richly dressed, some still clutching the instruments of a royal court. Woolley was staring at a mass grave hidden inside a royal one, and the obvious, unavoidable question was the one that has haunted this site ever since. Who were all these people? And how exactly did they end up down here in the dark, surrounding a single corpse? At the center of the most famous of these tombs lay a woman. Her name, pressed into cylinder seals of lapis lazuli found on her body, was Puabi. And the closer you look at her, the more remarkable she becomes. She was buried around 600 BCE, dressed in a headdress of gold ribbons, golden leaves, and flowers. Her upper body covered in a cape of beads made from gold, silver, lapis, and carnelian carried across trade routes from as far away as Afghanistan and the Indus Valley. Forensic examination later suggested she was around 40 years old when she died. But the detail that stops scholars cold is not the gold. It is the language. Her seal names her with the Sumerian title Nin, a word for queen or high priestess, and it names her alone. No husband, no king standing over her. In a world where even powerful women were almost always defined by the men beside them, Puabi appears to have stood on her own. She may have ruled in her own right. Read that again, because it matters. In one of the oldest cities on earth, a woman held power that was hers and hers alone. And that is exactly why what surrounded her is so disturbing, because a woman that powerful did not go into the ground quietly. In Puabi's burial, archaeologists counted around 52 other people laid to rest with her. 52? An entire retinue, arranged and dressed and positioned to accompany one woman into death. Now hold that number in your mind, because there is a grave nearby that makes even Puabi's look restrained. Woolley labeled it PG 1237. He gave it a nickname that tells you everything about what he found inside. He called it the Great Death Pit. And in the Great Death Pit, the body count climbed to somewhere around 73 human beings, most of them women, many of them young, many of them buried alongside the lyres and harps of a royal orchestra. Picture it. Dozens of young women, dressed in gold and red carnelian, lying in neat rows on the floor of a pit, some with the remains of musical instruments still resting against their bones. That is not a burial. That is a production. For decades, the world accepted a gentle explanation for this horror, and the man who gave it to us was Woolley himself. He looked at those neat rows, and he noticed that near many of the bodies lay a small cup. His theory, which became the accepted story in textbooks for the better part of a century, went like this. The attendants walked down into the pit of their own free will. They were the loyal servants, musicians, and guards of the royal household. They lay down in their finest clothes, drank some kind of poison or powerful sedative from those little cups, and drifted peacefully into a final sleep, choosing to follow their master or mistress into the afterlife out of devotion. It was tragic, yes, but it was noble. It was voluntary. It let everyone sleep at night, and for a very long time nobody had the tools to check whether it was actually true. Here is where everything changes, because in the 21st century the tools finally arrived. A team of researchers at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, which had co-sponsored the original dig and still held some of the remains, decided to do something Woolley never could. They took the skulls of the attendants and ran them through medical imaging. CT scans, radiographs, the same forensic techniques used today to investigate homicides and war crimes. They focused on two individuals in particular, a young woman known as Body 52 from the Great Death Pit, and a soldier known as Body 50 from a nearby king's grave. Two people from two separate tombs, separated in death by centuries of dust. And when the images came back, the peaceful poison story did not just wobble, it collapsed. Both skulls showed the same thing: depressed fractures, crushing injuries, damage consistent not with a quiet chemical death, but with blunt force trauma to the head. Somebody had struck these people hard with a heavy pointed object, with enough force to shatter and penetrate bone. The researchers even identified the likely weapon: a hafted instrument with a small, weighted, pointed striking end, something like a battle axe or a warhammer, precisely the kind of tool Woolley himself had catalogued from the cemetery decades earlier without realizing what it may have been used for. And because these two victims came from two different graves, the lead researchers argued something chilling. If two unrelated attendants in two separate royal tombs both died this way, it is reasonable to assume this was the method used on many of the others. The little cups were not the murder weapon. They were the theater. The real cause of death was violence. And now think about what that actually means for the women in that pit. These were not volunteers gently falling asleep. At least some of them, and possibly most of them, were struck down. The young musicians with the golden headdresses and the delicate lyres, the court ladies dressed in carnelian, the woman we know only as Body 52, they went into the ground with fractured skulls. The image the world had been sold of loyal servants choosing a beautiful death gives way to something that looks far more like ritual killing on a mass scale. But here is where it gets worse, because the researchers did not stop at how these people died. They discovered what was done to the bodies afterward, and that is arguably the most unsettling part of all. When the team analyzed the remains more closely, they found evidence that the bodies had been deliberately preserved. There were signs that the corpses had been treated with heat, and traces consistent with mercury, likely from cinnabar, the same brilliant red mineral used as a pigment and a preservative in the ancient world. In other words, after these attendants were killed, someone worked to slow the decay of their bodies. Someone heated them and treated them with chemicals so that they would not rot too quickly. Why would anyone do that? Because the funeral was not a single moment. It was a long, elaborate, drawn-out ceremony, a performance that may have unfolded over days. The bodies of the dead had to be arranged, dressed, positioned, and displayed, and for that grim tableau to hold together, the flesh could not be allowed to fall apart. So they embalmed the victims of a mass killing in order to keep the spectacle looking beautiful. Bludgeoned, burned, beautified. That is how one group of researchers actually described it. And that phrase should tell you exactly what kind of society we are looking at. Because this was not chaos. This was not a massacre in the heat of war. Everything about it was deliberate, organized, expensive, and controlled. The gold, the imported stones, the musicians, the wagons, the oxen, the careful rows, the preservation of the corpses, all of it required enormous resources and planning. This was strategy. It was elite power turned into ritual, a public demonstration that a single royal individual was worth the lives of dozens of others, and that the state had the wealth and the authority to take those lives and stage them like a work of art. What you're looking at in the Royal Cemetery of Ur is one of the earliest and most extravagant displays of human sacrifice in recorded history, and a huge share of the victims were women. That is the truth that the polite old story was hiding. And it is the truth that modern science finally dragged into the light. Now, at this point, some of you have heard a very different story about the women of Ur, and specifically about Puabi. If you have ever gone looking online, you have almost certainly run into the claim that her DNA was tested and revealed something not entirely human, that she carried the genes of the Anunnaki, the so-called sky gods of Sumerian myth, that museums are hiding her genetic results because they prove humanity was engineered by aliens. This idea has been pushed for decades, most famously by a writer named Zecharia Sitchin, who spent the end of his life begging institutions to sequence Puabi's genome so he could prove she was a demigod from a hidden planet. And this is exactly the kind of moment where a responsible account has to stop and be honest with you. There is no credible evidence that Puabi was anything other than human. There is no secret alien genome. The Anunnaki DNA story is not science. It is a myth built on top of a mistranslation and a lot of wishful thinking. But here's the twist, and it is the whole reason this topic matters. You do not need the alien story to be disturbed. The real genetics of ancient Mesopotamia are strange and unsettling enough on their own. Here's the first thing the real DNA revolution has taught us, and it is a problem hiding in plain sight. Mesopotamia is one of the hardest places on Earth to recover ancient DNA. The heat of Iraq destroys genetic material. For years, while scientists were reading the genomes of Ice Age Europeans and Neolithic Anatolians, the homeland of the world's first cities stayed almost genetically silent. We could read the Sumerians' cuneiform, their contracts, their poems, their laws, but we could barely read their bodies. Which means that every fragment of ancient Mesopotamian DNA that survives is precious, and every one that gets sequenced can rewrite the map. And in just the last couple of years, those fragments have finally started to speak. What they are saying is not what anyone expected. In a study published in early 2026, researchers managed to sequence the genomes of 17 individuals from a major ancient settlement in northeastern Iraq, spanning the Bronze and Iron Ages, close to the world Puabi lived in. And the picture that emerged was not one of a pure, isolated people. It was the opposite. The population was a genetic patchwork, carrying ancestry linked to Anatolia to the north, the Levant to the west, and the Caucasus and the vast steppe beyond. The researchers describe Mesopotamia with a single loaded phrase, a melting pot. The cradle of civilization was not built by one bloodline. It was built by waves of people mixing, migrating, and merging across thousands of years. And crucially, they found that when the culture changed, the population often did not get wiped out and replaced. The people stayed. They absorbed, they blended. The story we like to tell, of one civilization conquering and erasing another, turns out to be far too simple. And then came a discovery that stretched the map even further. In 2025, scientists sequenced the entire genome of a man who lived in Egypt around 4.5 to nearly 5,000 years ago, right around the time the Sumerian city-states were rising and the first cuneiform was being pressed into clay. For over a century, historians had noticed eerie similarities between early Egypt and Mesopotamia, shared pottery techniques, parallel writing systems, echoing art. But they assumed it was just trade, just ideas traveling along the rivers. This man's DNA said otherwise. A significant part of his ancestry traced back to Mesopotamia in the Eastern Fertile Crescent. In other words, it was not only goods and gods that moved between these two great civilizations. People moved, bodies moved, bloodlines crossed deserts and rivers. The world of Puabi was not a closed box. It was connected, mobile, and far more tangled than the textbooks admitted. Think about what that means for how we imagine these ancient women. They were not frozen figures in a static kingdom. They belonged to a world in motion. And this is where the DNA circles back to the women themselves in a way that is quietly devastating. When geneticists studied the deep ancestry patterns of the region, including populations descended from the ancient inhabitants of the southern Mesopotamian marshes, they found a specific genetic signature tied to how these societies were structured. The male lineages showed a strong local expansion that lined up almost exactly with the rise of the Sumerian city-states. The male genetic story was one of continuity and dominance in place. But the female story was different. The patterns pointed to practices like patrilocality, where women left their own families and moved into their husbands' communities, and unequal migration between men and women. In plain terms, the DNA preserves the shape of a society where men stayed put and held the power, and women were the ones who moved, who were traded between households and cities, who were absorbed into someone else's lineage. The genome remembers the gender roles. The bones remember the hierarchy. And in the royal cemetery, that hierarchy reaches its terrible conclusion, where dozens of women could be dressed in gold and then destroyed to honor the death of a single person. So let's put the whole picture together, because this is the part the clickbait never actually delivers. The disturbing truth about the women of ancient Sumer is not that they were aliens. It is that they were completely, painfully human, and that being human in that world could be catastrophic depending on where you stood in the hierarchy. On one end of the spectrum, you have Puabi, a woman who may have ruled a city in her own name, in an age when that was almost unthinkable, buried with a fortune in gold and lapis carried across a continent. And on the other end, you have the women of the Great Death Pit, young, richly dressed, musically gifted, and struck down with a weighted blade to the skull so they could be arranged around her like furniture, their bodies chemically preserved so the funeral would look beautiful for the mourners. The same society produced both. The same culture that could elevate one woman to a throne could bludgeon 70 others into the ground beside her. And modern science, the CT scanners and the genome sequencers, is the only reason we know the difference between the comforting myth and the brutal reality. What makes it worse is how much we still do not know, and how much the ground may still be hiding. Remember, the Penn Museum team could only scan a couple of skulls because most of the remains are scattered, damaged, or held in museums in London and Baghdad that have not all been examined with the same techniques. The researchers themselves said that CT scans of the skulls in those other collections could confirm or overturn their conclusions, which means the full story of how many of these women were killed and how is still locked inside bones that no one has fully studied. And Puabi's own genome, the actual scientific one, not the alien fantasy, has never been publicly sequenced and released. The technology now exists to try. The remains still exist. And yet the single most famous woman of ancient Sumer remains, genetically, a black box. We do not truly know where her bloodline came from. We do not know if she was local to Ur or an outsider who rose to power. We do not know if she was related to the very people buried around her. So sit with the questions this leaves behind, because they are far larger than a single tomb. If the women of the Great Death Pit did not choose to die, then who made the choice for them, and what did they believe was waiting on the other side that could possibly justify it? If a society this early, this sophisticated, this capable of poetry and law and astronomy, could also organize the ritual killing of dozens of young women as a form of political theater, then what does that tell us about the relationship between civilization and cruelty at the very moment civilization began? And if the DNA of this entire region has stayed silent for so long, hiding the true origins of the people who invented the city, the school, the written word, then how much of what we think we know about the dawn of human history is simply the comforting story we told ourselves because we never had the tools to check? The machines are only now waking up. The genomes are only now being read. The skulls are only now being scanned. And every time we look closer at the women buried beneath Ur, the peaceful version of the past falls a little further apart, and something older, colder, and far more human takes its place. Whatever is still sleeping in those bones, in those museum drawers, in that unsequenced royal genome, has been waiting for 4,500 years. And the truth is, we have barely begun to disturb it,